He believed the verdict was already written long before the judge ever raised the gavel, but he had no idea that in less than a minute everything he built would begin to unravel in silence. The courtroom of District 47 stood polished and imposing, its marble floors reflecting the cold morning light streaming through tall windows 12 feet high, every surface echoing power, control and certainty, and at the center of it all sat Richard Caldwell, a billionaire whose name alone could move markets. And silence, opposition, his tailored navy suit pressed to perfection, his silver watch catching the light with quiet authority. Everything about him signaled one thing: he was used to winning. Across the room Marcus Reed sat at the defense table, shoulders slightly hunched, hands clasped together, not in fear but in resignation. He had already been judged long before stepping into that courtroom, judged by appearances, by narratives written without him, by people who never intended to listen. The jury avoided his gaze. The prosecutor spoke with unwavering confidence, and every piece of evidence presented seemed to fall neatly into place, too neatly as if reality itself had been rehearsed. Meanwhile Richard Caldwell remained still, observing with the detached calm of a man who had invested heavily in the outcome. His legal team had constructed a flawless argument, each statement delivered with surgical precision, each pause calculated, every word designed to lead to one inevitable conclusion. And the judge, Harold Whitman, a man known for his strict adherence to order and efficiency, leaned slightly forward, already preparing the final sequence that would close the case. Outside the courthouse reporters waited, cameras ready, anticipating another decisive victory tied to Caldwell's influence. Inside the air felt heavier, every second stretching tighter as the moment approached, and yet in a far back row, nearly invisible to everyone, sat a woman, Elena Brooks, dressed simply in a gray coat, her hands resting quietly in her lap, her posture unremarkable, her presence unnoticed. She had arrived early, taken her seat without a word, and remained still as the trial unfolded, her eyes never leaving the center of the room, where power moved like an invisible force shaping everything around it. She didn't react when the prosecutor spoke, didn't flinch when the defense struggled, didn't shift when the jury exchanged uncertain glances. She simply watched, and in that stillness something was building, something no one else could see. As the judge adjusted his glasses and lifted the gavel, preparing to bring finality to the case, a silence settled across the courtroom, thick and expectant. Richard Caldwell allowed himself the faintest breath of satisfaction. Marcus Reed closed his eyes for just a second, as if accepting what was coming, and Elena Brooks finally moved just slightly, her fingers tightening against the fabric of her coat, her gaze sharpening with quiet resolve, because unlike everyone else in that room she knew something they didn't. She knew the truth had not yet spoken, and in the next few seconds everything they believed to be certain would begin to collapse. The gavel hovered for a fraction longer than it should have, and in that stretched moment something shifted, not in the room itself but in the quiet tension that had been building beneath every word spoken. Richard Caldwell noticed it first, not because he expected it but because he had spent a lifetime recognizing when control began to slip even slightly. His fingers paused against the polished wood of the table, his eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly as he scanned the courtroom again, searching for the source of that subtle disruption. But everything appeared exactly as it should. The judge composed, the attorneys prepared, the jury attentive, and Marcus Reed still seated with that same quiet resignation. Yet something no longer felt certain. Judge Whitman cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as if to reassert the rhythm of the proceedings, his voice steady but just a shade slower than before as he began to speak about the weight of evidence and the responsibility of the court. Each word measured, each pause deliberate but no longer effortless. And in the back row Elena Brooks inhaled slowly, her shoulders rising just enough to signal the shift within her. She had waited through every statement, every argument, every carefully constructed narrative designed to close this case before it ever truly opened, and now the moment had arrived, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet precision of someone who understood timing better than anyone else in that room. Richard leaned slightly toward his lead attorney, his voice low, controlled. "Finish this," he said, but even as the words left his mouth there was an edge to them, not urgency but awareness, the kind that comes when a man realizes the outcome he purchased might not be as guaranteed as he believed. The attorney nodded quickly, stepping forward to reinforce their final argument, his tone confident, his gestures sharp as he reiterated the sequence of events that pointed to Marcus Reed as the only logical conclusion, each sentence delivered as if it were undeniable truth. Yet the more he spoke the more the room seemed to listen differently, not with agreement but with a growing hesitation, subtle but present like a crack forming beneath polished glass. Marcus lifted his head slightly, his eyes no longer closed but focused somewhere ahead, as if sensing the same shift though he could not yet see it. Elena's hand moved from her lap to the edge of the bench, her fingers pressing lightly against the wood, grounding herself in the moment, her gaze unwavering, now fixed on the front of the courtroom where power had been speaking uninterrupted for far too long. And as the attorney concluded with a final confident statement declaring that justice demanded resolution, Elena stood up, not abruptly, Not with force but with a calm certainty that cut through the space more effectively than any raised voice ever could. The movement itself drew attention, a quiet ripple as heads turned one by one, the bailiff noticing first, then the judge, then finally Richard Caldwell, whose expression tightened as his eyes locked onto her for the very first time, and in that instant he understood something without knowing why. This was not interruption, this was the beginning of something he could not control. Your Honor, Elena said, her voice clear, steady, carrying across the room without strain, before you make your decision there is something you need to see, and the room, which had been so certain just moments ago, fell into a silence that felt entirely different from before, not expectant but uncertain, as if the truth itself had just stepped into the light and refused to be ignored. The judge did not speak immediately, and that hesitation alone was enough to fracture the illusion of certainty that had filled the courtroom just moments before. Judge Whitman slowly lowered the gavel without striking it, his eyes fixed on Elena Brooks as if weighing not just her words but the calm conviction behind them. You will identify yourself for the record, he said, his tone controlled but no longer absolute. Elena did not rush, she stepped forward into the open space, her presence no longer invisible yet still unassuming. My name is Elena Brooks, she said simply, no title, no explanation, just a name that meant nothing to most of the room, yet something in the way she stood suggested it should. Richard Caldwell leaned back slightly, studying her now with sharper attention, his mind moving quickly through possibilities. Witness, plant, opposition, tactic, procedural delay, none of them fully fit, and that uncertainty pressed against him in a way he was not accustomed to. And what exactly is it that you believe this court needs to see? The judge asked. Elena reached into her bag once more, her movements deliberate, unhurried, as if she had done this before, many times before. She placed a small flash drive on the evidence table, the sound barely audible yet it seemed to echo across the room. The full record, she replied. Quietly, a faint murmur spread through the courtroom, the phrase itself simple but its implication unmistakable. The lead attorney for Caldwell stepped forward quickly, his voice sharp with objection. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. This individual has not been recognized as part of these proceedings. Any material she presents cannot be verified or admitted without proper review. His words came fast, controlled but edged with urgency, and for the first time his confidence felt constructed rather than natural. Elena turned her gaze toward him, not confrontational, not defensive, simply steady. You are correct, she said calmly, it has not been reviewed. A slight pause, then, that is the problem. The room fell still again, the kind of silence that no longer belonged to procedure but to something deeper, something shifting beneath the surface. Marcus Reed watched closely now, his expression no longer distant but alert, as if something long buried was beginning to rise. Judge Whitman leaned forward, his fingers steepled, his eyes moving between Elena and the attorneys, then finally to the flash drive resting on the table, an object so small yet suddenly carrying weight far beyond its size. Richard Caldwell's jaw tightened, his voice low but firm as he addressed his legal team. Shut this down. But even as he spoke there was a trace of something unfamiliar threading through his control, not fear, not yet, but recognition that the situation was moving outside the lines he had drawn. Elena spoke again, her voice unchanged. Every document submitted in this case has been edited, timestamps adjusted, sequences reordered, statements rewritten just enough to appear consistent but not enough to raise suspicion. Gasps rippled through the room, not loud but sharp enough to be felt. The attorney scoffed, quickly attempting to regain ground. These are serious accusations without proof, they are meaningless. Elena did not react, she simply looked toward the judge. Then you should have no objection to seeing it. Judge Whitman held the silence for a long second, then nodded once, slow, deliberate. We will review it. And just like that the balance of the room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically but undeniably, and as the clerk reached for the flash drive Richard Caldwell realized something that had not crossed his mind until this moment. The case he believed was finished had just begun to come apart piece by piece, and the person doing it was someone he had never even noticed. The screen flickered to life and at first nothing seemed out of place, just rows of documents, timestamps, lines of testimony, everything presented exactly as the court had already seen. But then Elena spoke again, her voice low, steady, guiding attention without demanding it. Look at the sequence markers, she said, and the clerk hesitated only briefly before scrolling. The room leaned forward, not physically but in focus, every eye drawn to the smallest details. Now under a different light, Judge Whitman adjusted his glasses again, his gaze narrowing as numbers shifted on the screen. Timestamps that once appeared aligned now revealed subtle inconsistencies, seconds out of order, entries that should have followed one another now separated by gaps that had no explanation, the kind of detail that would be invisible to anyone not searching for it but impossible to ignore once seen. Richard Caldwell felt it immediately, not the evidence itself but the Reaction, the shift in the room, the quiet recalculation happening behind every expression. His attorney stepped forward, quickly pointing at the display. Minor discrepancies in digital records are not uncommon, Your Honor. They do not invalidate the substance of the case. His voice was firm, but it carried a strain, now a need to contain something that was no longer entirely under control. Elena did not respond to him. Instead, she stepped closer to the table, her eyes on the screen. Then let us continue, she said simply. The clerk scrolled further, and this time the changes were not subtle statements that had been presented as direct quotes, now showed layered edits, metadata revealing multiple revisions, each one small enough to pass unnoticed alone but together forming a pattern that was impossible to dismiss. Marcus Reed leaned forward, his hands no longer clasped but gripping the edge of the table, his eyes fixed on the screen as if seeing his own story rewritten in real time. A murmur spread again. Louder this time, not confusion but recognition. Judge Whitman raised a hand for silence but did not look away from the evidence. Explain this, he said, not to Elena but to the attorneys representing the case. Caldwell's lead attorney opened his mouth, then paused just long enough for the room to notice. We will need time to review the integrity of these files, he said, carefully choosing each word, but the confidence that once filled his tone had thinned. Richard Caldwell's expression hardened, his posture unchanged, but his stillness now carried weight, not control but resistance, as if holding the situation in place by sheer force of will. Elena finally turned toward him, her gaze calm, almost distant. The integrity is not the question, she said quietly, the pattern is. The judge leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping once against the bench, not in impatience but in thought. The courtroom no longer moved at the pace it had before, every second stretched, every detail examined with new caution. And then Elena added one more sentence, not louder, not sharper, but heavier than everything that came before. This case was not built on truth, it was built on alignment. The words settled over the room, and no one spoke for a moment, not the attorneys, not the judge, not even the observers in the gallery, because in that silence something became clear. The foundation of the case was no longer solid, and as the screen displayed yet another altered entry, Richard Caldwell realized that what had once been invisible was now undeniable, and the control he had relied on was beginning to slip through his hands, one detail at a time. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of conclusion, it felt like a place of exposure, every eye fixed on the screen as if searching for something they had missed before, something that should have been obvious but had been hidden beneath layers of precision and confidence. Judge Whitman leaned forward again, this time not as a formality but with intent, his voice lower, more deliberate. Continue, he said, and the clerk obeyed, scrolling deeper into the files, revealing not just inconsistencies but connections, patterns that linked statements to revisions to timestamps, and timestamps to external sources that had never been mentioned during the trial. Elena stood still beside the table, her presence no longer questioned yet still not fully understood. She did not rush to explain everything, she allowed the evidence to speak first, allowing the room to arrive at the truth on its own, because she knew that realization carried more weight than accusation ever could. Richard Caldwell's attorney attempted to step in again, but his voice no longer controlled the space. These correlations are circumstantial, they do not prove intent, he said, but the words felt thinner now, less convincing, as the screen displayed a series of synchronized edits across multiple testimonies, each one adjusted within the same narrow window of time, each one aligned with a narrative that had been presented as independent. Marcus Reed watched in silence, his breathing slower now, his posture no longer collapsed inward but rising gradually, as if the weight pressing down on him was beginning to lift, not because he had spoken but because something else had finally broken through. Elena moved only once more, her hand reaching toward the edge of the table, as she pointed to a final file. This one, she said quietly. The clerk opened it, and for the first time the room did not just react, it paused completely. The document displayed a chain of internal communications, not public records, not witness statements, but instructions, clear, structured and deliberate, outlining exactly how each piece of evidence should be adjusted to maintain consistency across the case, not fabricated entirely but refined just enough to remove doubt, to eliminate contradiction, to ensure alignment. Judge Whitman's expression changed, not dramatically but undeniably. The certainty that had defined his posture at the beginning of the hearing was gone, replaced by something far more cautious. Where did this come from, he asked, his voice no longer carrying authority alone but something closer to concern. Elena met his gaze calmly. From the same place everything else did, she replied, it was just never meant to be seen together. Richard Caldwell did not move, but the stillness around him had changed, it was no longer composed. It was rigid, his control not broken but strained, as if held together by force alone, his mind moving rapidly, calculating responses, outcomes, containment, but for the first time none of them presented a clear path forward, because the structure he had relied on was no longer intact, it was unraveling in front of him piece by piece, and no amount of silence could stop it. The judge looked toward the attorneys again, but this time not for argument for explanation, and none came quickly enough. The room remained suspended in that moment of realization where everything that had been certain now required reconsideration, and as the final document remained on the screen, one truth settled quietly across the courtroom. The case had not just been weakened, it had been redefined, and the person who had done it was still standing there without raising her voice, without revealing her position, without claiming anything except the truth, and that made her far more dangerous than anyone in that room had anticipated. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was heavy, defined by the weight of what had already been revealed and what was still waiting beneath the surface. Judge Whitman did not look at the attorneys this time. He looked directly at Elena Brooks, his voice quieter but carrying far more intention. "You said everything came from the same place," he said. "Then you already know where this leads." Elena held his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged, as if the outcome had never been in question. "Yes," she replied simply. The judge leaned back slightly, his hand resting against the bench, not tapping, not moving, just still as he considered the shift unfolding before him, because this was no longer about one case or one defendant, it was about the integrity of the entire process, and everyone in the room could feel it. Richard Caldwell exhaled slowly, the first visible sign that the situation had moved beyond his immediate control, his eyes briefly closing, not in defeat but in recalculation, his mind working through every possible angle, every remaining advantage, every way to contain what had already escaped. But the more he considered it, the clearer it became that containment was no longer an option. The structure had been exposed not in one dramatic moment but through a sequence of undeniable details that now connected too clearly to be dismissed. His lead attorney stepped forward again, though this time the movement lacked its previous certainty. "Your Honor, we request a recess to properly review this material and respond accordingly." The words were measured, professional, but behind them was urgency, not strategic but necessary, the kind that appears when the ground begins to shift beneath carefully constructed arguments. Judge Whitman did not answer immediately, his gaze drifting once more to the screen where the final document remained displayed, every line now carrying a different meaning than it had just minutes ago. Then to Marcus Reed, who sat quietly at the defense table, no longer bowed but upright, watching not with hope but with clarity, as if he understood that something fundamental had already changed. Elena remained still beside the table, her presence steady, not pressing for recognition, not claiming victory, simply standing in the space where truth had been placed and allowing it to exist without interference. "Denied," the judge said finally, his voice firm, returning to a level of authority that felt different from before, not assumed but earned. "This court will not pause to accommodate what should have been presented with integrity from the beginning." A subtle shift moved through the room, not loud but unmistakable, the kind that signals a turning point. Richard Caldwell opened his eyes again, his gaze locking onto Elena, not with dismissal, not even with irritation, but with something closer to realization. He had underestimated her, not in status, not in appearance, but in function. She was not part of the system he had navigated for years, she was something outside of it, and that made her unpredictable. Elena spoke once more, not to challenge, not to confront, but to complete what had already begun. "There is one more layer," she said quietly. The words did not rise above the room but they settled into it immediately, drawing every attention back to her, because everyone understood now that nothing she said was without weight. The clerk hesitated for only a second before looking toward the judge, who gave a single nod, and as the screen shifted to load the next file, the room held its breath, not in anticipation of argument but in recognition that whatever came next would not just affect the case, it would redefine everything they believed had already been decided. The new file opened slowly, as if even the system itself understood the weight of what it was about to reveal, and for a brief moment the screen remained blank, a white void that held the entire courtroom in suspended silence. Then lines of text began to appear, not formatted like testimony, not structured like legal argument, but raw data, unfiltered communication, timestamps, locations, identifiers, and beneath them a pattern that no longer needed interpretation. It spoke for itself. Judge Whitman leaned forward again, his posture now fully engaged, his earlier composure replaced by focused scrutiny. "What am I looking at?" he asked, though the question felt less like confusion and more like confirmation. Elena did not move, her eyes fixed on the screen as if she had already seen every line before. "Cross-reference logs," she said quietly. "Internal routing paths for every modified file." The clerk scrolled slowly, revealing how each document previously presented had passed through a specific sequence before being entered into evidence, not random, not independent, but directed, guided by a single origin point. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves had drawn closer to contain what was unfolding. Richard Caldwell's gaze hardened as he followed the sequence, each identifier, each timestamp aligning too precisely to ignore his breathing remained steady, but his stillness had shifted again, no longer Resistance now. It was calculation under pressure. The lead attorney stepped forward once more, though his voice lacked the authority it once carried. These logs do not establish authorship, they only indicate access. There is no direct link to intent or control, he said, carefully choosing his words, but the space between them revealed hesitation. Elena turned her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without fully engaging it. Then let us remove the ambiguity, she replied. The clerk clicked again, and the screen updated, revealing a final layer beneath the routing logs: authorization credentials, not names but encrypted signatures, unique identifiers assigned to those with clearance to alter evidence within the system. Judge Whitman's expression changed in a way that could not be concealed, his eyes narrowing, not in doubt but in recognition. Is this verified? He asked. The clerk nodded slowly. Yes, Your Honor, these signatures are consistent across all modified entries. A murmur spread across the room. No longer contained, no longer subtle, it carried a different tone now, not curiosity but realization. Marcus Reed exhaled quietly, his shoulders lowering as if a tension held for far too long had finally begun to release, but he did not speak, he did not move, he simply watched as the truth continued to surface. Elena's voice remained steady. Each modification required authorization. These are not random edits, they are controlled adjustments executed under a single credential chain. She paused just long enough for the meaning to settle before adding one final sentence, and that chain leads to one account. The room went completely still, not the silence of anticipation but the silence of impact, the kind that follows when something undeniable arrives without warning. Judge Whitman's gaze shifted from the screen to the attorneys, then finally to Richard Caldwell, whose posture remained unchanged but whose presence now carried a different weight, not authority, not dominance but exposure. His control had not just been challenged, it had been traced, mapped and presented in a way that could not be dismissed without consequence, and for the first time since the trial began, the man who had seemed untouchable was now at the center of the very system he believed he controlled, and every person in that room understood that whatever came next would not be argued, it would be revealed. No one spoke after the final line appeared on the screen because there was nothing left that required interpretation. The chain was complete, the access points, the authorization signatures, the routing paths, all converging into a single origin, and that origin no longer existed as an abstract concept. It had a direction, it had a source, and every eye in the courtroom turned slowly toward Richard Caldwell, not in accusation, not yet, but in recognition of what the evidence had already begun to suggest. Richard did not react immediately, his posture remained composed, his hands resting calmly against the table as if the moment had not shifted in his favor or against it. But inside the stillness something was changing, the kind of shift that only happens when control is no longer absolute. Judge Whitman's voice broke the silence, measured but unmistakably altered. Mr. Caldwell, he said, not loudly but with precision, this court requires clarification regarding the credential chain identified in these records. The words were formal, but the implication was not, and everyone in the room understood it. Caldwell turned his head slightly toward the bench, his expression controlled, his tone even. I am not responsible for internal technical systems, Your Honor. My involvement in this matter has been strictly legal and financial. The statement was delivered exactly as expected, confident, clean, distanced, but it landed differently now because the room had already seen too much. Elena Brooks watched him carefully, not with confrontation but with focus, as if measuring not what he said but how he said it. She stepped forward just enough to re-enter the center of the moment. That would be consistent, she said quietly, drawing attention without raising her voice, if the credentials were independent. A slight pause, then she added, they are not. The clerk adjusted the screen once more, isolating the authorization signature, expanding it, showing the embedded identifier sequence, the pattern repeating across every modified file, not duplicated, not copied, but originating from a single secured source. Judge Whitman leaned closer, studying the detail longer, this time his silence heavier, his attention sharper. These credentials, he said slowly, are tied to a private access node, not standard court infrastructure. The statement shifted something fundamental. The attorneys looked at each other briefly, searching for alignment that was no longer there. Caldwell's lead counsel stepped forward again, but the movement felt reactive, not strategic. Private systems can interface with public records under authorized conditions. This does not establish misuse. His voice held, but only just. Elena did not respond immediately. She allowed the explanation to exist in the space before gently removing it. Authorized by whom? She asked simply. The question did not echo, it settled, and no one answered right away because the answer was already forming in the room. Piece by piece Marcus Reed watched the exchange with steady eyes, no longer searching for hope, but witnessing truth unfold in real time. And for the first time since the trial began, he was not the center of the case, he was the reason it was being reconsidered. Judge Whitman sat back slowly, his hand resting against the bench once more, but now it was different, no longer a position of routine but of control regained through awareness. "This court will not proceed under compromised conditions," he said firmly, each word deliberate. "All evidence presented is now subject to immediate review and verification." A murmur rose again, but it was no longer uncertainty, it was consequence. Richard Caldwell remained still, his gaze fixed ahead, but his silence now carried something new, not dominance, not even resistance, but acknowledgement that the system he had moved within had just shifted beyond his reach, and Elena Brooks, who had entered without recognition, now stood at the center of it, not elevated, not announced, but undeniable. Because she had not forced the truth into the room, she had revealed that it had been there all along, waiting for someone to see it clearly. The courtroom no longer belonged to any one person, it had become a space defined by scrutiny, every movement observed, every word measured against what had already been revealed. Judge Whitman remained still for a moment longer, as if allowing the weight of the situation to settle fully before moving forward. "Clerk, isolate the origin point of the credential chain," he said, and the request itself carried a finality that no one could ignore. The clerk complied quickly, hands moving across the keyboard as the display shifted once more, narrowing down the sequence into a single focal point, one identifier, one access node, one source. The screen paused there, as if the system itself recognized the significance of what it was showing. A faint sound moved through the room, not quite a gasp, not quite a whisper, but something in between, a collective realization that the abstract had now become specific. Richard Caldwell did not look at the screen immediately. Instead, he kept his gaze forward, his posture unchanged, but his stillness now deliberate, calculated, as if choosing exactly when to acknowledge what everyone else had already seen. Elena Brooks did not look at him, she watched the screen the same way she had from the beginning, with quiet certainty, as though nothing unfolding surprised her, because it had all been known long before this moment. "Your Honor," the clerk said carefully, "the access node is not part of any registered court system, it is external and secured through private authentication." The statement settled heavily, and Judge Whitman leaned slightly closer, his voice lower but unmistakably firm. "Trace it." The clerk hesitated only briefly before continuing, fingers moving again as lines of code and routing paths unfolded on the screen, until finally the system stopped, not because it could not go further but because it had reached its conclusion. The identifier expanded, resolving into a name attached to the credential chain, not hidden, not encrypted anymore, but clearly visible to anyone in the room. The silence that followed was absolute. The judge did not repeat it, he did not need to. Every person present had already seen it. Marcus Reed exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering in a way that spoke not of relief yet but of recognition that something irreversible had just occurred. The attorneys on Caldwell's side shifted uneasily, their alignment broken, their confidence no longer shared but fragmented, each of them now aware that the narrative they had presented could no longer hold under what had been uncovered. Richard Caldwell finally turned his head, his eyes moving to the screen for the first time since the identifier appeared, and in that moment the composure he had maintained began to thin, not collapse, not visibly fracture, but change in a way that could not be undone, because what he saw was not accusation, it was confirmation, his name tied directly to the chain that had altered the course of the case. Elena spoke then, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a clarity that carried across the entire room. "The system did not fail," she said, "it followed instructions." Her words did not challenge, they concluded. Judge Whitman straightened slightly, his expression now set not by assumption but by evidence. "Mr. Caldwell," he said again, but this time the formality felt different, no longer procedural but direct, "you will remain available to this court for immediate inquiry." It was not a request, it was not a warning, it was the beginning of accountability. The room remained still as the meaning of that shift settled into place. Because power had not just been questioned, it had been redirected, and for the first time since the trial began, Richard Caldwell was no longer positioned above the process, he was now within it, and Elena Brooks, who had entered without introduction, now stood as the one who had changed its course, not by force, not by volume, but by revealing what had always been hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the moment it could no longer be ignored. The shift was no longer subtle, it had taken form, settled into the structure of the courtroom and redefined every position within it. Judge Whitman did not hesitate now, his authority no longer drawn from routine but from clarity. "All proceedings are suspended pending full investigation of the evidence presented." He stated each word precise, leaving no space for interpretation. The sound of his voice carried differently than before, not louder but heavier, as if anchored by the weight of what had already been revealed. The courtroom did not erupt, it did not react with noise, it reacted with stillness, the kind that follows when something irreversible has already occurred. Richard Caldwell remained seated, his posture unchanged, but the silence around him had transformed. It was no longer the silence of control, it was the silence of exposure, the kind that isolates rather than elevates. His legal team moved slightly closer to him, their earlier coordination replaced by quiet urgency, whispered exchanges, measured glances, each of them recalibrating not strategy but position, because the foundation they had relied on was no longer stable. It had been dismantled piece by piece in full view of everyone present. Marcus Reed sat still, his eyes no longer searching, no longer questioning, but steady, fixed ahead, as if understanding that the moment he had waited for was not one of victory but of restoration. Elena Brooks stepped back from the center of the room, not retreating, not withdrawing, but allowing the space to shift without her presence dominating it. She had done what she came to do, and she did not need to remain at the center for it to matter. Judge Whitman's gaze followed her briefly, then returned to the bench. Mr. Caldwell, you will remain in this jurisdiction until further notice. Your involvement as indicated by the evidence requires immediate inquiry. The words were formal, but their impact was direct. Caldwell nodded once, a controlled acknowledgement, but there was no response, no attempt to reclaim narrative, no argument offered, because there was nothing left that could be addressed in the way he had always addressed it. The system he had moved through no longer responded to influence, it now responded to evidence. The clerk began securing the records, the screen dimming slightly as the files were archived, each movement deliberate, each action reinforcing the transition from assumption to accountability. The attorneys stepped back, their presence no longer commanding the room but existing within it like everyone else, subject to the same shift that had redefined the proceedings. Elena moved quietly toward the exit, her steps measured, her expression unchanged, as if the outcome had never been uncertain. A few observers turned to watch her pass, not because she demanded attention but because they understood now that she had altered something fundamental. Without ever raising her voice, without ever positioning herself above the process, she had simply revealed what had been hidden and allowed the system to correct itself. Richard Caldwell watched her for a moment longer than necessary, not with anger, not with disbelief, but with recognition, the kind that comes too late to change the outcome but just in time to understand it, because for the first time he had encountered something he could not anticipate, not influence, not control. And as Elena Brooks reached the doors of the courtroom and stepped into the hallway beyond, the light shifted slightly across the polished floor inside, and in that quiet transition one truth settled fully into place. Power could shape perception, but it could not withstand truth once it was seen clearly, and in that moment the room did not celebrate, it did not react, it simply remained still, because everyone present understood that what had just happened would not end here. It had only just begun. The courtroom slowly began to empty, but the silence did not leave with the people. It lingered in the air, heavy and unresolved, as if the walls themselves were holding on to what had just unfolded. Richard Caldwell remained seated long after the others had started to move, his attorneys speaking in low, controlled tones beside him, but their words no longer shaped the moment, they only reacted to it. The man who once dictated outcomes now listened, and for the first time the direction did not come from him. Marcus Reed stood carefully from the defense table, his movements steady, not rushed, not uncertain. He looked toward the bench where Judge Whitman had already stepped away, then toward the screen, now dimmed, its glow fading into reflection rather than revelation, and for a brief moment Marcus simply stood there, absorbing the shift that had taken place, not just in the case but in the way he was seen, because the weight that had been placed on him had not been removed by argument, it had been lifted by truth, and that difference mattered more than anything. Elena Brooks had already reached the corridor outside the courtroom, the sound of her steps soft against the polished floor, the noise of distant voices echoing from other rooms, other cases, other lives continuing forward as if nothing had changed yet everything had. She did not look back, she did not pause, because she understood something that few in that building did. Moments like this were never the end, they were only the point where hidden things became visible, and once seen they could not be returned to where they came from. Behind her, inside the courtroom, Richard Caldwell finally stood, his posture still composed but altered in a way that could not be restored. His eyes moved once more to the doorway where Elena had exited, not searching, not questioning, but acknowledging a presence he had failed to recognize until it was too late. One of his attorneys spoke quietly, suggesting immediate steps, containment responses, outreach, but Caldwell raised a hand slightly, not to interrupt but to stop the illusion that control could still be asserted in the same way. Because even he understood now that the structure had changed and it would not bend back into place through force or influence. Judge Whitman returned briefly from the side chamber, his robe settling as he re-entered. His expression firm but no longer distant. Mr. Reed, you are free to go pending further review of the case. All charges are suspended until this matter is fully resolved. The words were simple but their meaning reached far beyond the moment. Marcus nodded once, not in celebration, not in relief, but in understanding, because what had been taken from him was not just time or reputation, it was certainty, and that was not restored instantly. It would take time, but for the first time that time would belong To him, as Marcus walked toward the exit, the same path Elena had taken, the space between them felt connected, though they had barely spoken, because both had stood in the same moment where truth outweighed power and neither had needed to say more than necessary. Outside the building, reporters began to gather, their voices rising with questions, speculation, shifting narratives, but inside the echo remained quieter, more precise, a recalibration of what had been accepted without question for too long. And as Richard Caldwell stood alone for just a second before following his legal team out into the waiting attention of the outside world, one realization settled deeper than anything else. This was not a loss defined by a single case, it was the beginning of a process he could not predict, because for the first time the system had not responded to him, it had responded to something else entirely, something that did not negotiate, did not adjust, and did not yield. Once revealed, the courthouse steps were crowded now, not with certainty but with questions, voices overlapping, cameras flashing, every angle searching for clarity. In a moment that refused to simplify, Richard Caldwell moved through the space, surrounded by his legal team, yet separated from them by something that could not be seen, his presence still commanding attention but no longer directing it. Reporters called his name, asked about the evidence, the credentials, the chain that had led back to him, but he did not respond, not because he could not, but because every answer now carried weight beyond control. Every word would no longer shape perception, it would be measured against what had already been revealed. Inside the building the atmosphere had changed in a quieter way. Clerks moved with greater caution, conversations lowered into careful tones, as if the institution itself had recognized the shift. Judge Whitman remained in his chamber reviewing the material again, not because it was unclear but because it required full acknowledgement. Every line, every connection, every implication, no longer part of a single case but part of a broader question about how far influence had reached. Marcus Reed stepped outside into the open air, the light different from the filtered brightness of the courtroom. It felt wider, clearer but not lighter. He paused for a moment on the steps, not looking at the cameras, not acknowledging the attention, simply standing still, as if grounding himself in a reality that had just been restored but not yet fully understood, because what had been taken from him had not only been time, it had been trust, and that was something no ruling could return immediately. Elena Brooks stood across the street, partially removed from the gathering, her presence blending into the movement of the city unnoticed again, as if she had stepped out of the moment as easily as she had stepped into it. She watched quietly, not observing the chaos but the pattern within it, the way narratives were already shifting, the way assumptions were being reconsidered, the way a system that once appeared fixed had begun to move differently. Richard Caldwell reached his car at the edge of the curb, his hand resting briefly on the door before pausing. Not out of hesitation but recognition that stepping inside would not remove him from what had begun, it would only delay the next phase. His reflection in the tinted glass looked unchanged, composed, precise, controlled, but he understood now that control did not operate the way it once had, because it had encountered something it could not absorb or redirect. Elena turned away from the scene without looking back, her steps measured, her pace steady as she moved into the flow of the city, disappearing not dramatically but naturally, as if she had never intended to remain visible for long, because her role had never been to stand at the center, it had been to shift it, and once that shift had taken hold, her presence was no longer required behind her. The courthouse remained standing, unchanged in structure but altered in function. Every person who walked through its doors from that moment forward would carry a different awareness, not spoken, not announced but present, because something had been revealed that could not be unseen. And as the day continued and the noise outside slowly gave way to the rhythm of ordinary movement, one truth settled deeper than any headline or statement could capture: the system had not been broken, it had been tested, and in that test it had revealed exactly where it could no longer be controlled and where it would now have to stand on its own. The city moved on as it always did, traffic flowing, conversations blending into the background rhythm of daily life, but for those who had witnessed what unfolded inside that courtroom, something had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. Richard Caldwell sat in the back seat of his car as it pulled away from the courthouse, the glass separating him from the outside world, reflecting the same composed image he had carried for years. Yet now that reflection felt different, not because it had changed but because he understood now that influence had limits, not defined by power but by truth, and once those limits were reached, no amount of control could restore what had been exposed. His phone vibrated once, then again, messages, requests, statements waiting for response, but he did not reach for it, not immediately, because for the first time the response was not his to shape, it would be shaped by what had already been revealed, and that was something he could not direct. Marcus Reed walked several blocks away from the courthouse before stopping near a quiet intersection, the noise of reporters no longer following him, the space around him open and unguarded. He looked up briefly at the sky, then back down the street ahead, not searching for anything, just acknowledging that the path forward was now his to define again, not Determined by accusation, not constrained by a narrative built without him but still marked by what had happened, because truth may restore position but it does not erase experience, and he understood that. Rebuilding would take time, patience, and something deeper than relief. Elena Brooks continued walking through the city unnoticed, blending into the movement of people crossing streets, entering buildings, continuing lives untouched by the moment she had just altered. She carried no recognition, no visible acknowledgement of what she had done, and that was exactly as intended, because her role had never been to be seen, it had been to ensure that what needed to be seen could no longer remain hidden. She paused briefly at a crosswalk, not looking back, not checking the outcome, because she already knew how it would unfold, not in dramatic declarations but in quiet accountability, the kind that does not announce itself but changes everything over time. Inside the courthouse, Judge Whitman sat alone, reviewing the files once more, not searching for doubt but confirming what had already become clear. Every document, every signature, every connection aligned with a precision that left no room for dismissal, and as he closed the file he understood that the decision ahead was no longer about a single case, it was about reaffirming a principle that had been tested and had to be upheld without compromise, because the moment that principle bends it does not return to its original form, it fractures. The day continued, the city moved forward, but beneath the surface something